Have Disney World and Disneyland closed before? Yeah, they have, and for really interesting reasons. We've got all the details for you today. Hey everybody, it's AJ for Disney Food Blog. Now, with all the craziness going on in the world and the Disney parks right now, we're faced with an unprecedented event in Disney history. All the parks in the world are currently closed for the first time ever, and not just that, but the US-based parks, Disney World and Disneyland, are closed for the longest amount of time for each park ever. So then, when and how long in the past have Disney parks in the US been closed? We're taking a look right now. I think you'll actually be surprised. Let's start with Disneyland. This park opened all the way back in 1955 and until now has made it all those years with just 3 closures. The park didn't initially start out being open 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Initially, the park was closed Mondays and Tuesdays during the slower time of year. And 8 years after the park first opened, it was closed on November 23rd, 1963, after President John F. Kennedy's assassination. This was the day following the assassination. The park remained closed out of respect for the fallen president. The park reopened to the public the following day. Now, interestingly, another historic Disney park-related event was occurring at the same time as the Kennedy assassination. On November 22nd, the day Kennedy was shot, Walt Disney was in Florida scouting locations for his next park. He and his team checked out multiple locations in Florida, but when he flew over the land that would ultimately become the Magic Kingdom in Disney World, he looked out the window and announced, "That's it," and the rest is history. Walt flew back that evening to California. When his plane landed, he was full of happy news, but was then told that while he was out, Kennedy was killed. In 1994, Disneyland saw its next scheduled closure, or so we think. See, this one is not without controversy. California is prone to earthquakes, but thankfully in all the years Disneyland has been around, there has only been one time the park was affected by them. On January 17th, 1994, at around 4:30 in the morning, the area was shaken by a 6.7 magnitude earthquake. This was one of the largest recorded quakes at the time and was repeatedly so strong it was felt all the way over in Las Vegas. The park was closed for the day following the quake to check the park and attractions for any damage. Now here's where the controversy comes in. Everywhere on the internet will tell you the park was closed following this quake. From major news outlets to smaller blogs and everywhere in between, everyone seems content saying Disneyland closed for the day. Everyone except Yesterland.com, who claims everyone is wrong. In fact, they went on to say the park was open for business, although each attraction opened only after it was thoroughly inspected. Newspapers at the time reported that Disneyland stayed open. The mistaken fact that Disneyland closed that day has taken on a life of its own on the internet in recent years. So did it or didn't it? With limited access to newspapers from the time, it's hard for us to say. So unless you were there in 1994 and can tell us for sure, what we do know is Disneyland was really careful to check everything in the parks following the earthquake to keep guests safe. This wasn't the only time Disneyland closed attractions, not the whole park, due to an earthquake though. In 2010, 14, and 19, Disneyland remained open but closed attractions following a quake to inspect all the rides for damage. All rides in each case were cleared and later reopened to guests. Smaller quakes have hit the park with no effect whatsoever. In June of 2012, for instance, Cars Land at Disney California Adventure was celebrating their grand opening with a red carpet event. A noticeable quake hit during the festivities, which many acknowledged and then kept celebrating. The last unplanned closure for Disneyland happened on September 11th, 2001. The Twin Towers in New York City were struck by planes in the morning, and it was just about 6 a.m. in Disneyland. The park had enough time to see the situation unfold and make the call to not open for the day. On the other coast, Disney World, which is in the same Eastern time zone as New York, had been open for a few hours before the incident occurred, leaving them in a different situation of having to make the call to close already open parks early for guest safety. The parks reopened on September 12th, but with new security measures in place, including security screenings, heavier police presence, and canine presence. Now, Disneyland has closed early multiple times over the years, but usually for scheduled events like private parties or even movie premieres like the Pirates of the Caribbean films that used Main Street for their red carpet. Disneyland has also closed early multiple times due to the weather, most notably when heavy rains would cause walkways to flood. But there's one notable time that the parks closed early for a not-so-scheduled reason, though: the invasion of the Yippies. This was a sudden closure of Disneyland midday, and it was for a pretty bizarre reason. The Yippies invaded Disneyland. The Yippies, or Youth International Party, were a group of protesters who planned to organize to take over Disneyland on August 6, 1970. This date was the 25th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. Keep in mind, in 1970, the Vietnam War was on everybody's minds still, and like many other protest groups at the time, this group was out to make a statement about the war. Bank of America was a main sponsor of Disneyland at the time, and the Yippies took offense with B of A and were convinced the large bank was responsible for much of the war. This seemed to be their main reasoning for attacking Disneyland specifically. The protest group began placing ads in LA newspapers telling others to gather at Disneyland on that day, featuring an image of Mickey Mouse with a machine gun. They promised to liberate Minnie Mouse, among other radical claims. Disneyland worked with local police to be prepared for the event. They planned on over 100,000 protesters and had police outside the gates waiting to spring into action if needed. On August 6th, only around 300 Yippie protesters made their way into the park. They weren't particularly organized, and most blended in with regular guests. One of their main, more organized plans seemed to focus around overtaking Tom Sawyer Island, of all places. They made their way over to the island, climbed up on the rocks, waved a Viet Cong flag, and began smoking a lot of stuff they're not allowed to be smoking in Disneyland. Disneyland security responded by shutting down rafts to the island to try and limit guest exposure to them. Few groups of Yippies began getting into physical fights with regular park guests. Some tried to tear down the American flag on Main Street and ripped the patriotic bunting off of Town Hall. Later in the afternoon, a group of the Yippies began marching down Main Street to the Bank of America branch located there at the time, looking like they were ready to do some damage. On the other end of Main Street were around 100 police in riot gear armed with billy clubs. Not the scene you typically imagine in the happiest place on earth. A police helicopter hovered low over Main Street with a police official on a bullhorn shouting to guests to evacuate the park. 300 additional police were armed just outside the gates to ensure the protesters all left without a scuffle. Disneyland was closed 6 hours early that day. Now moving on to Disney World, let's take a look at the times the most magical place on Earth has closed unexpectedly. Spoiler alert, it's mostly due to weather. Buckle up because we're gonna go over a lot of hurricane-related closures, guys. Florida is warm mostly year-round and well-suited to a theme park like Disney World, but it's also right in the middle of the part of the country most affected by hurricanes. Did you know Disney World is considered by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to be one of the safest places in the United States to be when a hurricane strikes? In 2009, they certified Disney World with the Storm Ready designation, meaning they're prepared to handle any storm that might hit the area. All right, let's start with Hurricane Elena. Hurricane Elena was the first storm to close the parks early, but not for a full day. This happened on August 31st, 1985. Both Magic Kingdom and Epcot, that's all there was back then, closed at 5 p.m. The parks opened the following day with no noteworthy damage. Hurricane Erin on August 2nd, 1995, had the parks face their first time opening late from a hurricane. Following the storm passing, the parks openings were delayed to 11 a.m. Hurricane Floyd is the first time a storm closed the parks for a full day. That's 1999 on September 14th. Category 4 Hurricane Floyd was making its approach to the Disney World area, and in response, Disney World closed all of its theme parks, water parks, and downtown Disney, now known as Disney Springs, early that afternoon. Epcot and Magic Kingdom closed by 2 p.m., everywhere else was closed by 3. Most parks were closed the next day as well, but when the storm changed course, Animal Kingdom and Downtown Disney were reopened on September 15th. The other parks opened the following day. Due to the early reopening of Animal Kingdom, it was reported bus drivers were finding upwards of 500 to almost 2,000 guests waiting for transportation to Animal Kingdom. Guests were anxious to get into a park and out of the confinement of their resorts, and Animal Kingdom was their only real option. This was the first storm that Disney World faced a closure due to dangerous weather, resulting in Disney solidifying how they handle guest safety with the storms. With guests confined to their resorts, they deployed chefs from restaurants in the parks to resort restaurants to help cook for the larger amounts of guests contained in their hotels. Cast members stayed on property to ride out the storm at each resort and help with entertaining guests and maintaining guest safety. The next time Disney World would face a massive storm at its door would be in 2004. In fact, 2004 was a bad year for Disney and hurricanes, if you guys remember. I certainly do. But more on that in a bit. On August 13th, 2004, all of the parks were closed and guests were restricted to their resorts as Category 4 Hurricane Charlie was heading for Disney World. The storm closed all the parks just for one day, and they were open late the following day with a few attractions closed temporarily to inspect for damage. Most damage reported was minor, like broken light bulbs or uprooted or broken landscaping. Now, less than 1 month after Charlie, the parks were closed again for Hurricane Francis. On September 4th, 2004, all the parks at Disney World were closed to ensure safety during this hurricane. They all remained closed on the 5th and reopened on the 6th, with just Magic Kingdom and Epcot seeing a slight delay in opening. Only minor damage was sustained, including some light cosmetic roof damage and minor landscaping damage. Poor Disney couldn't catch a break in 2004, though. A few weeks after Francis, another storm storm was heading for the parks. This time, her name was Jean. The storm forced the parks to close on September 26, 2004. The damage was incredibly minor, and they reopened the following day. The next one occurred in 2016. Category 5 Hurricane Matthew had its sights set on Disney World, resulting in a 2-day closure from October 6th to the 7th, 2016. Again, very minor damage was sustained. And Category 5 Hurricane Irma was one of the more significant storms to hit the parks. The damage at Delta parks was stronger, though still relatively small. Facades and signs saw a bit of damage here and there, and significant amounts of downed tree branches were found all around the resort following the storm. The parks closed early on September 9, 2017 to prepare for the storms and reopened on September 12. The most recent storm to hit Disney World happened last fall, Hurricane Dorian, and looked like it was headed straight for Disney World, prompting an early closure on September 3, 2019. As quickly as they announced the closure, the storm seemed to change course, and the majority of the storm avoided Disney World, which opened the following day. On to non-hurricane related closures, we really just have one, September 11th, 2001. We already discussed how this affected Disneyland, but in Disney World they faced a much different situation. The parks were already open and starting to fill up by the time the terrorist attacks began around 9 a.m. Eastern. The park's response to the situation was pretty incredible. Within 30 minutes, all of the parks were completely cleared of guests. Cast members were instructed to form human walls that would gently move guests toward the exits. A message was broadcast over the loudspeakers in the parks that due to unforeseen circumstances, the parks were closed for the day. Cast members were instructed not to tell guests specifically why the parks were closing, but if asked directly, to give the reason for the closure. Due to the lack of social media and cell phones at the time, most guests were unaware of what was happening in New York and relied on word spreading around the park. The parks remained closed for the day and reopened the following morning with new security measures in place, much like Disneyland. So this brings us to the current closures. Disneyland, Disney World, and all of the international parks are currently closed to help reduce the spread of the COVID-19 virus, or coronavirus as it's being commonly called. Why is this a big deal? Well, for starters, all of the parks have never been closed like this, let alone for this long. The US parks are tentatively closed through the end of the month at this time. The parks in Asia have extended their closures, so we're not sure at this time if the US parks will act similarly. Only time will tell. No one has contracted the virus in the parks, and to Disney's knowledge, no one with the virus has even entered the parks. But having so many people in such close contact could easily encourage the spread of the virus, so out of an abundance of caution, the parks chose to close. Remember hearing about measles outbreak in Disneyland a few years back? In late 2014, Disneyland was pinpointed as the location responsible for transmission of 147 confirmed cases of the measles, according to the CDC. With so many people in such a small place, if one person has something you can catch, there's a high chance folks will. What's happening now with COVID-19 is the parks trying to avoid a situation like the measles a few years back, but on a massively larger scale. This is a really unique and unprecedented situation we're facing, not just in the Disney parks, but in the world. So we'll be closely monitoring the situation as it develops. As of right now, the parks are offering guests the ability to cancel, reschedule, or refund vacations. We have all the information on DisneyFoodblog.com, and you can reference our previous video from earlier this week that'll give you all the information you need to know. We'll be continuing to produce content to give you videos over the course of this closure. We've got lots of content, we've got lots of things to say about Disney, and we know that eventually the parks will reopen and you'll be planning your trips. So we're going to keep bringing Disney into your computers, your mobile devices, your social media. But please know that our staff is working remotely. We're doing everything we can to prevent the spread of the virus and to keep you updated on what Disney's doing as well. Please stay safe, everybody. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching. As always, this is AJ for Disney Food Blog, and we'll see you real soon.